Hey everyone, I hope your studying is going well. So here's where we left off on our digestive system and uh, the function of microvilli and absorption in the digestive system. So just before we get into going through hormonal control, we'll just recap this, right? So remember that our digestive process has basically taken all of our nutrients, right? So we take in carbs, we take in proteins, we take in fats, and even we take in nucleic acids. So if the food that we're eating is raw whole food, whether it be a piece of meat or a salad or right these living organisms, well, they're going to contain all biological molecules, right? And we are going to break those down through the digestive system, carbs into our monosaccharides, right? Proteins down into their amino acids, and fats down into monoglycerides and fatty acids, and nucleic acids, we break them down into nucleotides. That's the digestive process. And now they hit the small intestine and absorption has to occur. So we've got to get all those nutrients, right? All of these small building blocks, we've got to get that into the bloodstream, and we got to deliver all that stuff to every single cell in our body. And so the structure of this microvilli lining our small intestine has to kind of make sense. Remember, we talk about how each organ has all the tissues. There's epithelial tissue, so we can see epithelial cells lining this. There's connective tissue in the blood vessels and the lymph vessels that line this villus sticking up. And so at this point, we are now absorbing all these nutrients through these epithelial cells and getting them into the transport system that they need to get throughout the body. And so um, here's where we talk about how we get these, how we absorb these through the epithelial cells by the process of endocytosis, right? I strongly encourage you to go back and review that, specifically pinocytosis. Pinocytosis, which is the engulfing of large molecules in huge quantities, right? So like we talked about last day. Now, once these epithelial cells collect all of this, all of this stuff, right? The breakdowns, the fatty acids from fats, the nucleotides, the monosaccharides, as the epithelial cells begin to absorb this stuff through pinocytosis, certain nutrients are going to be directed to different locations. And that's based again on their chemical nature. We talked about polar and non-polar, right? Sorry. And so when we talk about a chemical substance being polar, well, remember that's like water, right? It has oppositely charged ends, and polar likes polar. And if a chemical is nonpolar, right, which we've talked about, like fats, nonpolar likes nonpolar. Like dissolves like. So these substances are all slightly different in their polar and nonpolar natures. Monosaccharides like sugars, glucose and fructose, and amino acids and nucleotides, these guys are polar by nature. They tend to have these oppositely charged regions, right? Positive and negative charges. So these guys are polar. Whereas our fatty acid, along with the monoglyceride, tends to be nonpolar, right? And so our body has to deal with them differently. Now, enter the bloodstream and our lymph. Now, we haven't talked about blood, we haven't talked about circulatory system, and we certainly haven't talked about lymph, but we will coming up. And so we have to do a little bit of preamble here, but ultimately we've talked enough, I think, about blood to know that blood is polar, right? It is mostly water. And therefore will dissolve our polar nutrients, hence glucose, amino acids, nucleotides. All right, these things will move from the epithelial tissue up here, and I'll erase some of this now, but those nutrients will move through the epithelial and they'll continue through the epithelial, through the tissue, and they'll enter into the bloodstream. And we can see how we have blood coming into this and we have blood leaving in the vein. So this blood leaving the vein and going to the rest of the body is going to be high in these nutrients, being carted off to every possible location in your body. So now, after the absorption of fatty acids, so the epithelial cells are also going to absorb fatty acids. And just a reminder that, remember, a fat has this glycerol backbone, which is kind of a 3-carbon long backbone, and then via an ester bond is connected to these long fatty acid tails, right? And there's this double bond in there, which we can review if you want to go back over that, but that's from our chapter 3. That this fat, a triglyceride, which we've talked about, is basically a glycerol backbone with 3 fatty acids attached. Now, in the digestive process of lipase acting on this, and if you look back here to our enzyme section, I kind of drew a picture of how lipase breaks this down into fatty acids and monoglycerides. And again, we can review this stuff, but you guys got to let me know that. So when this fat is digested, these fatty acids are cleaved off, and those fatty acids are going to be absorbed by the epithelial cell, along with the remaining piece of this monoglyceride here. So we actually have 1 fatty acid tail attached. And so fatty acids and monoglycerides are actually reassembled. Okay, so they enter into the epithelial and now it starts putting them back together again. I know this seems weird, but I want to think about what one of the functions of fats are, right? We store fat in our body for lots of reasons: insulation, protection of our organs, long-term energy store, right? So the epithelial goes to work reassembling those fatty acids back onto the monoglyceride, recreating our triglyceride, and now this is going to be transported into a what is called a lymph lacteal, and that's this guy here that's in green. Okay, now the reason being is that this is a more non-polar friendly environment. Okay, and what's going to happen is this lymph vessel, which is another component of our bodies, it's going to transport fluids, and it transports fats nicely because it does have water in it, but it has a lot of other substances that make it a much more friendly environment to transport fats, because remember, non-polar likes non-polar. So the epithelial cells kind of package up the fat and transport them into the lymph lacteal, and then this lymph lacteal will take those fats away and bring them into the larger lymphatic system of transport, and eventually those lymph vessels are going to connect into the venous circulation. Okay, so remember, arteries take blood away from the heart, and veins take blood back to the heart. Okay, so eventually the larger transport vessels of the lymph system are going to connect fats to re-enter the venous circulation. Now, we'll talk more about this in circulation, but it's important that you understand fats traveling through our arteries can put us into some trouble. And we need to know a little bit more about veins and arteries a little bit, but if you look at the cross section of an artery, the opening to which blood travels through can be significantly smaller than the, and I'm maybe exaggerating this, the opening to a vein. And so fats are bypassed the venous system, or sorry, they bypass the arterial system to minimize the potential of clogging up these arteries. And so by traveling through the lymph system and then entering into the venous system, they can then be carried to different parts of our body, and the fats will eventually, well, I guess I say it down here, but these fats will eventually be stored in adipose tissue. So remember that this is another type of connective tissue, which is basically a fat cell. And so the process of taking them away in the lymph just bypasses arterial circulation and minimizes the impact of clogging our arteries. Takes those fats into the venous system, which as they're transported throughout our body will be stored in adipose tissue. And of course, that adipose tissue kind of tends to predominate in different areas. Females have a significant amount of adipose tissue in their breasts. We tend to store adipose tissue around our mid-region, our bellies, right? Even in our hips and our butts. So we've got these different regions where we tend to build up adipose tissue. And that's where these fats are going to eventually end up. All right. Now, I'm going to leave out this review of 6 functions of the liver because well, I'm not going to leave all of them out. I'm just going to focus on one in particular, but it's important that you review all your functions of the liver. The one that I'm going to pull out here right now is recalling that the liver is responsible for storing glucose as glycogen. So remember that when you think about glucose entering into our bloodstream, so it's one of those nutrients absorbed, and remember, leaving the small intestine, blood travels right to the liver. And so a lot of our glucose that we've digested through the meal we've eaten is going to be taken up by the liver and stored as glycogen. Now, that's during your meal and maybe the short time after your meal. So during your meal and after, right? And after. However, in between meals, so we often don't eat nonstop throughout the day, or we never eat, hopefully, nonstop throughout the day. But, in the hours between, the liver can also release glucose through the breakdown of glycogen, and release it into the blood to help maintain blood sugar. So the liver is an important organ towards maintaining blood sugar. And what's really important is that it doesn't do it on its own. It's done under hormone regulation. Okay, so I'm going to pause the video there, and then I'm going to create a smaller video just so that the 2 videos aren't, or it's not such a long video all at once.